What happens when a little girl's heartfelt prayer stops a busy crowd in its tracks and changes the life of a broken man forever? In this incredible story, a chance encounter on a cold winter night sparks a journey of forgiveness, redemption, and hope that will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Snowflakes dance gently in the icy air, blanketing Denver, Colorado, in a shimmering sheet of white. The bustling streets of the 16th Street Mall were alive with holiday cheer. Twinkling lights hung from lampposts, and the faint sound of carolers echoed in the distance. Yet amid the festive atmosphere, the biting cold of December cut through the air, merciless and unforgiving. Sienna Caldwell walked hand in hand with her mother, Naomi, weaving through the crowds of bundled-up shoppers. At just 8 years old, Sienna's small stature and wide, curious eyes made her seem even younger. Her thick pink scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, but it didn't muffle her endless stream of questions. "Mom," Sienna asked, her voice muffled by the scarf, "why do some people have to be outside in the cold like this?" Naomi sighed softly. She was used to her daughter's questions. They came from a place of innocence and compassion, but this one felt harder to answer. "Not everyone is as lucky as we are, baby," Naomi said, tugging her daughter's hand gently to keep her moving. "Some people don't have a warm home or a place to stay." Sienna's brow furrowed as she looked around. The streets were filled with people, but not everyone was carrying shopping bags or sipping hot chocolate. Her gaze caught on a man sitting alone on a bench near Civic Center Park. He was wrapped in a tattered coat, his shoulders hunched against the cold, and his face half hidden beneath a scruffy beard. A small plastic bag sat at his feet, filled with what looked like all his belongings. "Mom, look!" Sienna pointed, her small hand pulling at Naomi's coat. "That man is all by himself." Naomi hesitated, glancing over at the man. She recognized the look of despair in his posture. Years of working as a nurse had taught her how to read people's pain, but she also knew better than to get involved with strangers on the street. "Sienna, come on," she said firmly. "It's getting late. Let's go." But Sienna didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on the man, who now sat motionless, staring at something in his hands. It was a photograph, its edges worn and frayed, as though it had been held 1,000 times. "Why is he holding a picture?" Sienna asked, her voice softer now, almost reverent. "Mom, we have to help him." Naomi knelt down to Sienna's level, her tone gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, I know you want to help, but we can't always stop for everyone. There are shelters where people like him can get warm. Let's keep walking." "No, Mom," Sienna insisted, shaking her head. Her small voice carried an unusual certainty. "I want to talk to him." Naomi opened her mouth to argue, but the determined look in her daughter's eyes stopped her. With a resigned sigh, she stood up and let go of Sienna's hand. "Okay," she said, her voice tinged with caution, "but I'm staying close." Sienna took tentative steps toward the man, her boots crunching on the snow-covered sidewalk. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped, her breath visible in the cold air. "Sir?" she said softly. The man didn't respond. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Sienna stepped closer, her voice louder this time. "Sir, are you okay?" The man blinked as though pulled from a distant memory. He looked up at Sienna, his tired blue eyes meeting her curious brown ones. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, with a voice hoarse from disuse, he muttered, "I'm fine, kid. Go back to your mom." Sienna didn't move. "Why are you alone in the cold?" she asked, her tone soft but insistent. The man's lips twitched, almost forming a bitter smile. "Because I have nowhere else to go," he said, holding up the photograph, "and no one left to go to." Sienna's gaze dropped to the picture. It showed a younger version of the man, clean-shaven and smiling, with a little girl on his lap. She looked about Sienna's age, her blonde hair tied in pigtails. "Is that your daughter?" Sienna asked, her voice filled with wonder. The man hesitated, then nodded. "Her name's Grace," he said quietly, "but she's not little anymore. Haven't seen her in years." Sienna looked up at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You must miss her a lot." The man didn't answer, but the way his shoulders slumped said enough. Behind Sienna, Naomi shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the gathering crowd. Some people were watching the exchange curiously, while others hurried past, unwilling to spare more than a fleeting glance. Naomi stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Sienna's shoulder. "We should go," she said softly. Sienna looked back at her mother and then at the man. "Wait," she said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small pack of tissues, one of the few things she had to offer. She handed it to the man. "It's not much, but it might help." The man stared at the tissues for a long moment before taking them. "Thanks, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Naomi gently guided Sienna away, but the little girl looked back over her shoulder, her heart heavy with questions she couldn't yet put into words. As they walked away, she whispered, "Mom, we have to help him." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She glanced back at the man, who now sat clutching both the photograph and the tissues, and sighed. "We'll see, Sienna," she said softly. "We'll see." The air felt colder as Sienna and Naomi made their way back down the street, the hum of holiday cheer now a distant echo. But Sienna's thoughts were fixed on the man they had just left behind. His tired eyes and trembling hands replayed in her mind like a haunting melody she couldn't shake. "Mom," Sienna said, stopping abruptly, "I can't leave him like that." Naomi sighed deeply, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Sienna, we've done what we could. You gave him the tissues, and I'm sure he appreciated that." "But it's not enough," Sienna insisted, her voice cracking slightly. She turned back toward the man, who was still sitting on the bench, now staring blankly ahead as snowflakes settled on his worn coat. "Mom, I need to help him." Before Naomi could respond, Sienna broke away, her small boots crunching through the snow as she hurried back to the bench. Naomi followed quickly, her motherly instincts torn between pride and concern. "Sir?" Sienna said softly as she approached again. Dan looked up, his face etched with surprise and weariness. Sienna knelt down in front of him, her small hands clasped tightly together. "I want to pray for you." Dan blinked, clearly caught off guard. He glanced at Naomi, who stood a few steps behind, her expression unreadable. Then his gaze returned to Sienna. "Pray," he echoed, his voice hoarse. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because you need it," Sienna replied simply, her voice steady and sincere. "And because I think God can help you." Dan looked away, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond, but he didn't tell her to leave either. Taking his silence as permission, Sienna closed her eyes and bowed her head. "Dear God," she began, her voice clear despite the bustling street around them. "Please help this man. He's cold and tired and doesn't have a home. But I know you love him, and I know you can help him find his daughter again. Please take care of him and remind him that he's not alone." Amen. The words were simple, spoken with the unguarded honesty of a child, yet they carried a weight that seemed to hang in the air. When Sienna opened her eyes, she saw Dan staring at her, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. He quickly looked down, trying to hide the emotion threatening to spill over. "Why would you care about someone like me?" Dan muttered, his voice breaking. "I'm just... no one." "That's not true," Sienna said firmly, her small voice filled with conviction. "Everyone is someone." Around them, the hum of the street began to change. People who had been rushing past slowed down, their curiosity piqued by the unusual scene. A young woman stopped, her arms full of shopping bags, and watched silently. A man with a thermos of coffee hesitated before stepping closer, placing the steaming cup beside Dan without saying a word. Naomi, still standing nearby, noticed the growing attention and felt her own heart swell with a mix of pride and unease. This wasn't what she had planned for the evening, but watching her daughter's determination made her question whether she had underestimated the power of small acts of kindness. Dan glanced at the coffee, then at Sienna, his expression a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "I don't deserve any of it." "That's not for you to decide," Sienna replied confidently, her tone far wiser than her years. A couple walking hand in hand stopped, their holiday shopping bags swinging as they paused to observe. A man in a heavy coat holding a thermos hesitated nearby, watching the little girl kneeling in the snow. "What's she doing?" someone murmured. "She's praying for him," another answered, the words carrying a mix of wonder and curiosity. One by one, people began to stop and take notice. A young woman reached into her shopping bag and pulled out a container of baked goods, stepping forward to place it gently on the bench beside Dan. "Here," she said softly. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." A man with a thick scarf wrapped around his neck approached next. He handed Dan a steaming cup of coffee from his thermos, his expression hesitant but kind. "Stay warm, buddy," he said, giving Dan a pat on the shoulder before walking away. Dan sat frozen, his eyes darting from Sienna to the growing group of strangers offering small tokens of care. A woman with a toddler reached into her wallet and handed Dan a $10 bill, her child staring wide-eyed at the scene. Another man pulled off his gloves and dropped them in Dan's lap. Dan's hands shook as he held the items, his voice barely audible. Why are you doing this?" Sienna looked up at him, her face glowing with sincerity. "Because you need it," she said simply, "and because everyone deserves kindness." Dan's lip trembled as he looked at her and then at the crowd. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he quickly turned away, trying to hide them. "It's too much," he whispered. "I don't deserve this." An elderly woman stepped forward, her face lined with wisdom and warmth. She placed a hand gently on Dan's shoulder. "Honey, no one's perfect, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve a little kindness. Take it and let yourself believe in something good again." Naomi watched from a few steps away, her own heart heavy with emotion. She hadn't expected this. A simple moment with her daughter had turned into a small miracle. "Sienna," Naomi called softly, motioning for her. But Sienna didn't move. Instead, she reached out one last time, her small hand resting lightly on Dan's. "See," she said with a smile, "people care about you. You just have to let them." Dan stared at her for a long moment, then nodded ever so slightly, his tears glistening in the soft glow of the holiday lights. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you, little one." Sienna stood up and dusted off her knees, her smile as bright as the snow around them. As she walked back to her mother, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their hearts touched by the small girl's bravery and compassion. Naomi opened her arms and Sienna ran into them, burying her face in her mother's coat. "You did good, baby," Naomi whispered, kissing the top of Sienna's head. As they walked away, Naomi glanced back at Dan one last time. He sat on the bench, holding the photograph of his daughter and clutching the gifts from strangers. His shoulders, once slumped with despair, seemed to sit a little straighter. For the first time in years, Dan felt a spark within him, something small and fragile, but alive. It was hope. Unnoticed by most of the gathering crowd, a woman stood a few steps away, partially concealed by the glow of a holiday shop display. Maria Castillo adjusted the strap of her camera and raised it to her eye, the lens focusing on the unusual scene unfolding before her. She had been on her way to cover a holiday charity gala, another predictable event filled with polished speeches and photo opportunities. But something about the little girl kneeling in the snow caught her attention. There was an honesty here, a rawness that felt more powerful than anything she could hope to capture at the event she was supposed to attend. Through her viewfinder, Maria saw the man on the bench, disheveled, weathered, and clutching a photograph like it was his last connection to something precious. Then there was the child, her tiny frame radiating determination as she knelt beside him. Around them, strangers paused, some offering gifts, others simply watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet reverence. Click. The first photo captured Sienna's bowed head and clasped hands, her pink scarf stark against the snow. Maria lowered the camera slightly, observing the interaction. There was something profound in the way the little girl reached out, seemingly oblivious to the barriers that often kept people apart. Age, race, class. Maria hesitated before lifting the camera again. This time she focused on the man. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes hollow yet flickering with something that hadn't been there moments before. Was it gratitude? Hope? Click. Another photo, this one capturing the crowd. Diverse and unexpected, each person a puzzle piece in a larger story. Maria had been a journalist for over a decade, but she couldn't remember the last time something so genuine had unfolded right in front of her. Lowering the camera, Maria pulled out her small notebook and jotted down a few quick observations. Little girl prays for homeless man. Growing crowd. Strangers offering food, money, gloves. Man appears moved, holding a photo of a young girl. Emotional connection visible. She glanced at her watch. The gala could wait. This moment felt more important. As the scene began to wind down, Maria lingered on the edge of the crowd, watching as Sienna returned to her mother. She noted the way Naomi wrapped her arms around her daughter, whispering something Maria couldn't hear. And then her eyes returned to the man on the bench. He sat motionless, his hands still gripping the photograph and the gifts he'd been given, his gaze distant but thoughtful. Maria adjusted her scarf and stepped closer, her boots crunching softly in the snow. She approached the man cautiously, careful not to intrude too abruptly. "Sir," she said gently, her voice low so as not to startle him. Dan looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly in suspicion. "Yeah?" Maria crouched slightly to meet his eye level. "I don't mean to bother you," she began, her tone warm and non-threatening. "I'm a journalist with the Denver Gazette. My name's Maria Castillo. I couldn't help but notice what just happened here." Dan's brows furrowed, his grip tightening on the photograph. "What do you want?" Maria held up her hands in a gesture of reassurance. "I don't want to cause you any trouble. I think this moment deserves to be shared. That little girl, what she did, it's something people need to see. And I think your story is important." Dan hesitated, his body language wary. "I don't have a story," he said gruffly. "I'm just some guy who made too many mistakes." Maria's eyes softened, and she lowered herself fully into a crouch, keeping her voice steady. "Everyone has a story, Mr. Whitaker," he mumbled reluctantly. "Dan Whitaker." "Mr. Whitaker," Maria repeated with a small nod. "You might think your story isn't worth telling, but I promise you it is. That photograph you're holding, who's in it?" Dan glanced down at the picture, his expression tightening. He didn't answer. Maria waited a beat before continuing, her tone gentle. "That little girl, Sienna, she prayed for you because she believes in you, even though she just met you. I think others would too, if they knew what you've been through." Dan looked away, his jaw clenching. "I don't need anyone's pity." "It's not pity," Maria countered softly. "It's understanding, and maybe even a chance to reconnect with people who care about you." Dan's shoulders sagged slightly, but he said nothing. Maria didn't press him further. Instead, she stood up and took a step back. "I'll leave you be," she said, her voice kind. "But if you change your mind, you can find me at the Denver Gazette. I'd love to hear your story." With that, Maria slipped a business card from her coat pocket and placed it gently on the bench beside him. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Whitaker." Dan didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on the card after she walked away. Maria turned and headed back toward the street, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had a feeling this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Dan Whitaker sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the shelter that night, the small space dimly lit by the weak glow of a single bulb overhead. The soft murmur of other residents preparing for bed drifted through the room, but Dan remained motionless. His hands, calloused and rough, held the photograph he had clung to for years. He traced the edges of the picture with his thumb. A younger version of himself smiled back at him, his arm wrapped protectively around a woman with golden hair and warm, sparkling eyes. On his lap sat a little girl, her blonde curls framing a face that mirrored her mother's. Grace. His mind wandered, unearthing memories he both cherished and feared to revisit. Years earlier, Dan's life had been a picture of stability. As a civil engineer in Denver, he'd played a key role in several urban development projects. His work was his pride, but his family, Sarah and Grace, was his joy. He remembered the mornings when Sarah would brew coffee while humming softly, and the evenings when Grace would beg him to read her just one more story before bed. But all of that shattered on a rainy November evening. Sarah had been driving home from visiting her parents when her car skidded on a wet highway and collided with a truck. The news came in a phone call that seemed to stretch into eternity, the words echoing in Dan's mind long after he dropped the receiver. He had never truly recovered from that moment. Grief consumed him like a slow-moving storm, eroding his resolve and stealing his focus. He withdrew from Grace, unable to face the reminders of Sarah in her laughter, her mannerisms, her very existence. He began drinking, first to numb the pain, and then because he didn't know how to stop. His work suffered, mistakes piled up, and after months of warnings, his employer finally let him go. The job loss deepened his despair, and soon his savings were gone. Unable to maintain the house Sarah had loved, Dan sold it. He and Grace moved into a small apartment, but even then, his downward spiral continued. Eventually, Child Protective Services intervened. They cited neglect, his inability to provide stable care for Grace, as grounds to place her in the custody of Sarah's sister. Dan didn't fight it. By then, he had convinced himself that Grace was better off without him. Dan blinked, snapping back to the present. He stared down at the photograph, his heart aching with a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The image of Grace, her joyful smile frozen in time, was both his most precious possession and a haunting reminder of his failures. He leaned back against the cold wall, closing his eyes. The events of the day replayed in his mind. Sienna's prayer, the strangers who had stopped to offer him food and warmth. Why would anyone care about someone like him? Across town, Naomi Caldwell sat at the small dining table in her modest apartment, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Sienna was in her room, fast asleep after a day filled with questions and emotions. Naomi sighed, staring at the blank notepad in front of her. She had planned to use the evening to jot down ideas for a speech she was preparing for her nursing team's holiday charity event, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man on the bench. Naomi had seen many patients struggling with homelessness over the years, but she had always kept her distance emotionally. As a nurse and a single mother, she didn't have the luxury of stretching herself too thin. But watching Sienna interact with Dan that evening had stirred something in her. A mix of admiration for her daughter's compassion and a gnawing fear that the world might take advantage of that kindness one day. She glanced toward Sienna's bedroom door. Raising her daughter alone hadn't been easy. There were days when Naomi wondered if she was doing enough, if her long shifts and constant exhaustion were robbing Sienna of the childhood she deserved. But tonight, seeing Sienna's unwavering determination to help a stranger, Naomi felt a flicker of pride. Maybe she was doing something right after all. The next morning, Maria Castillo sat in the newsroom of the Denver Gazette, scrolling through the photos she had taken the night before. She stopped at one, Sienna kneeling in the snow, her hands clasped in prayer beside Dan. The juxtaposition of the little girl's innocence and the man's weariness was striking. Maria felt a lump form in her throat as she stared at the image. She began typing furiously, the words flowing as she pieced together the narrative. She titled the article, "A Prayer in the Cold, A Little Girl's Act of Kindness Brings Hope to a Stranger." The story highlighted the harsh realities of homelessness in Denver, but it also celebrated the small moments of humanity that could make a difference. Maria included a brief account of her conversation with Dan, mentioning the photograph he held and the daughter he hadn't seen in years. She didn't reveal too much, leaving space for readers to imagine the rest. When the article went live later that day, it quickly gained traction. Readers flooded the comments section with messages of support and offers to help. "This brought me to tears," one person wrote. "We need more people like this little girl." Another comment read, "If anyone knows how to connect with Dan, I'd love to donate clothing and food." Maria watched the responses pour in with a sense of hope and responsibility. She had no idea where Dan's journey would lead, but she was determined to follow it. Something told her this was only the beginning. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dan Whitaker stepped into the lobby of the Denver Outreach Services shelter. The air was warm, a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside, but Dan still felt the chill in his bones, a cold born of years spent on the streets and in solitude. A volunteer at the reception desk smiled kindly. "Welcome," she said. "You're Dan, right? Maria Castillo called ahead about you." Her tone was bright but not intrusive, as if she had spoken to many like him before. Dan nodded cautiously, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his weathered coat. "Yeah," he mumbled. "That's me." "Well, you're in the right place. Let me show you around," the volunteer said, leading him down a corridor lined with faded posters about recovery programs and support groups. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, But Dan felt a wave of discomfort. The shelter felt safe, and safety wasn't something he'd known in a long time. Meanwhile, across town, Naomi Caldwell was busy packing a small tote bag filled with toiletries and winter clothes. Sienna hovered nearby, her excitement evident in the way she bounced on her toes. "Are you really going to help at the shelter, Mom?" Sienna asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and pride. "Yes, I am," Naomi replied, zipping up the bag. "Seeing how much you cared about that man made me realize I could do more too." Sienna beamed. "Maybe we'll see him there." Naomi smiled faintly. "Maybe," she said. "But remember, helping isn't just about one person. There are a lot of people who need support, not just him." Sienna nodded, though her mind was already racing with thoughts of Dan and the photograph he had clutched so tightly. She couldn't stop wondering about the girl in the picture, Grace, and why they were apart. Back at the shelter, Dan was introduced to a staff member named Pastor Caleb. Caleb, a tall man in his early 50s, with a warm but firm demeanor, extended a hand. "Dan, it's good to meet you. I'm Pastor Caleb." Dan hesitated before shaking his hand. "Thanks," he said gruffly, unsure of what else to say. Caleb gestured toward a small office with a couch and 2 chairs. "Let's talk for a minute." Dan followed reluctantly, sinking into one of the chairs while Caleb took the other. The room was modest but inviting, with a few potted plants and a bookshelf filled with titles on faith, recovery, and self-help. "So, Maria told me a little about you," Caleb began, "but I'd like to hear it from you. What brought you here?" Dan shifted uncomfortably. "I guess I just got tired of being out there," he said, his voice low. "She said this place could help." Caleb nodded, his expression patient. "It can, but only if you're willing to let it. The first step is the hardest, trusting people again." Dan let out a humorless chuckle. "Trust hasn't exactly worked out for me." "I get that," Caleb said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been where you are. 15 years ago, I was sleeping under a bridge, convinced my life was over. But someone gave me a second chance, and I'm here today because of that." "You're not alone, Dan." Dan looked up, surprised by the honesty in Caleb's tone. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded. Caleb leaned back. "Take it one day at a time. That's all anyone can do." Later that evening, Naomi and Sienna arrived at the shelter with their donations. The staff welcomed them warmly, and Naomi quickly found herself sorting through boxes of clothing in the back room. Sienna, however, was more interested in exploring. As she wandered the halls, she peeked into the common area and froze. There, sitting by the window, was Dan. He looked different in the soft light, less like the man on the bench and more like someone trying to find his way back to himself. Sienna walked up to him, her steps light but purposeful. "Hi, Mr. Dan," she said brightly. Dan looked up, startled. "Sienna, what are you doing here?" "My mom and I are helping," she explained, plopping into the chair across from him. "I'm so glad you're here." Dan's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Yeah, well, I'm giving it a shot." Sienna tilted her head, her curiosity bubbling over. "Do you still have the picture of your daughter?" Dan's hand instinctively went to his pocket. He pulled out the worn photograph and placed it gently on the table between them. "This is Grace," he said quietly. "She's pretty," Sienna said, studying the picture. "Where is she now?" Dan's gaze fell to the table. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's been years since I saw her. She's probably all grown up by now." "Do you miss her?" "Every day," Dan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't think she'd want to see me. Not after everything I've done." Sienna frowned. "I think she would, if she knew how much you missed her." Dan looked at her, startled by the conviction in her voice. He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unsure of how to explain the weight of his guilt to a child. Sienna leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with determination. "You should find her, Mr. Dan. I can help you." Dan shook his head, a rueful smile playing on his lips. "That's sweet of you, kid, but it's not that simple." "Maybe it is," Sienna said undeterred. "You just have to try." Before Dan could respond, Naomi appeared in the doorway. "Sienna," she called gently, "it's time to go." Sienna hopped off the chair, turning back to Dan with a smile. "I'll see you soon, okay?" Dan watched her go, the photograph still resting on the table in front of him. For the first time in years, the thought of finding Grace didn't feel impossible. It felt worth trying. That night, as Sienna climbed into bed, she clutched the small notebook she had started keeping after meeting Dan. On the first page, in her neatest handwriting, she wrote, "Find Grace." Dan Whitaker woke to the sounds of the shelter stirring to life. Beds creaked, hushed murmurs floated through the air, and the aroma of weak coffee wafted in from the common room. He sat up slowly, his back aching from years of sleeping on uneven surfaces. The cot beneath him, while far from luxurious, felt like a small luxury, a reminder that, for now, he was inside, away from the relentless cold. Yet even as he stretched and prepared for another day, doubt gnawed at him. He had been at the Denver Outreach Services shelter for a week now, but the warmth of a roof and a meal hadn't eased the storm inside. Each night, guilt churned through his thoughts. Memories of Grace, of Sarah, of the man he once was and the one he had become. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of Grace, smoothing its crumpled edges. "What's the point?" he muttered to himself. "She's better off not knowing me." Later that morning, Pastor Caleb found Dan sitting alone at a table in the common area, staring blankly at a half-eaten breakfast. Caleb pulled up a chair and placed a mug of coffee in front of Dan. "You've got a lot on your mind," he said, his tone gentle but probing. Dan shrugged, not meeting Caleb's gaze. "I'm just trying to get through the day." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Dan, I know what it's like to feel stuck, to look at your life and think it's too broken to fix. But I also know that sitting here drowning in guilt won't change anything." Dan let out a hollow laugh. "Easy for you to say. You're not me." "No," Caleb agreed. "But 15 years ago, I was. I spent every day hating myself for the mistakes I made, for the people I hurt. It wasn't until someone told me I was worth saving that I started to believe it." Dan glanced up at Caleb, his expression wary. "And what? Everything just got better?" "No," Caleb admitted. "It was hard work. Still is some days. But I didn't do it alone. That's why I want you to come to one of our group sessions tonight. You don't have to say anything. Just listen." Dan hesitated. The thought of sitting in a room full of strangers, airing his failures, made his stomach turn. But something in Caleb's voice, steady and unyielding, gave him pause. Finally, he nodded. "I'll think about it." Meanwhile, across town, Sienna Caldwell sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, her notebook open in front of her. She had drawn a simple heart at the top of the page with the words, "Find Grace," written inside. Next to her, Naomi sat at the edge of the bed, her laptop open as she scrolled through search results. "You said her name is Grace Whitaker, right?" Naomi asked. Sienna nodded eagerly. "And Mr. Dan said she's grown up now. She might still be in Denver." Naomi typed the name into a local directory and skimmed the results. Most were dead ends, too old, too young, or with no relevant details, but one listing caught her eye. Grace Whitaker, Assistant Manager, Skylight Books. The bookstore was located downtown, just a few blocks from the 16th Street Mall. "I think I found her," Naomi said, glancing at Sienna. "Really?" Sienna's eyes lit up. "It looks like she works at a bookstore," Naomi said. "But before we get too excited, we need to be careful. This might not be the right person, and even if it is, we can't just show up and surprise her." "But what if she wants to see Mr. Dan?" Sienna asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Naomi placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Let's take it one step at a time, okay? We'll visit the bookstore first, just to make sure." That afternoon, Maria Castillo sat in her office at the Denver Gazette, poring over the responses to her article, "A Prayer in the Cold, A Little Girl's Act of Kindness Brings Hope to a Stranger." The piece had gone viral, drawing thousands of comments and shares. Readers expressed admiration for Sienna's compassion, but many also turned their attention to the broader issue of homelessness in Denver. Maria scrolled through the messages, noting offers to donate money, clothes, and food to local shelters. One email stood out, a heartfelt letter from a man who shared his own experience of losing everything after a medical crisis. "Your article reminded me that kindness still exists," he wrote. Thank you for telling this story. Inspired by the response, Maria decided to expand her coverage. She picked up her phone and called Pastor Caleb at the shelter. Caleb, she said, I want to do a follow-up series, not just about Dan, but about the systemic challenges people like him face. Housing insecurity, mental health, addiction. People need to understand the bigger picture. I think that's a great idea, Caleb replied. You're welcome to visit anytime. I can introduce you to some of the residents who are willing to share their stories. Maria smiled. Thanks, Caleb. I'll be there tomorrow. That evening, Dan hesitated outside the door to the group therapy room. The muffled sound of voices reached him, and his palms felt clammy. He almost turned back, but Caleb appeared behind him, his presence steady and reassuring. Come on, Caleb said, opening the door. Just listen. Inside, a circle of chairs was arranged in the center of the room. Men and women of various ages sat together, their expressions a mix of vulnerability and strength. As the session began, Dan stayed silent, listening to the others share their stories. Stories of loss, addiction, and rebuilding. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. At Skylight Books, Naomi and Sienna stepped inside, the warm scent of paper and coffee greeting them. Behind the counter, a young woman with blonde hair and a quiet confidence greeted them. Her name tag read, Grace Whitaker. Can I help you? Grace asked, her voice polite but distant. Naomi hesitated, glancing at Sienna, who clutched her notebook tightly. We're looking for someone, Naomi said carefully, and I think you might be able to help us. Grace frowned slightly. Who are you looking for? Naomi took a deep breath. Dan Whitaker. He's your father, isn't he? Grace's expression froze. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, she replied, I think you should leave. Sienna's heart sank, but Naomi placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. We're sorry to bother you, Naomi said softly. If you ever change your mind, you can find us at the Denver Outreach Services shelter. As they left the store, Sienna looked up at her mother. What now? She asked. Naomi sighed. Now, we wait. At the Denver Outreach Services shelter, Dan sat in the common room, his head in his hands. The sounds of clinking dishes and muted conversations faded into the background as he wrestled with his thoughts. The idea of finding Grace, of facing her after all these years, terrified him. What could he possibly say to her? How could he ask for forgiveness when he couldn't even forgive himself? Dan? Pastor Caleb's voice broke through the haze. The older man pulled up a chair and sat across from him, his expression calm but firm. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Dan let out a humorless laugh. Feels about right? Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What's going on? Dan hesitated, then pulled the photograph of Grace from his pocket. It's her, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My daughter. I haven't seen her in over a decade. And now there's a chance. But what if she doesn't want to see me? What if I just make things worse? Caleb studied him for a moment before speaking. Dan, I can't promise you how Grace will react, but I can promise you this. If you don't try, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Dan shook his head. I've already messed up too much. Maybe it's better if I just leave. Let her live her life without me dragging her down. Caleb's voice grew firmer. Leaving won't fix anything. Staying, facing your fears. That's where the real work begins. You've come this far, Dan. Don't quit on yourself now. Dan looked at Caleb, the man's steady gaze grounding him. After a long pause, he nodded. I'll stay, he said quietly. For now. The hum of Skylight Books was a comforting backdrop, a mix of soft chatter, the rustle of pages, and the faint whir of the espresso machine from the small cafe tucked in the corner. Grace Whitaker stood behind the counter, organizing a stack of newly arrived novels. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her name tag gleamed under the overhead light. At 23, Grace had built a quiet life for herself, far removed from the chaos of her childhood. The bookstore was her refuge, a place where stories offered solace and escape. She didn't talk much about her past, even with coworkers who had become friends. It was easier that way. She remembered the sound of her father's laughter before everything fell apart, the way he used to carry her on his shoulders at the park. But those memories were overshadowed by others. His drinking, the nights he didn't come home, and the day he let her go without a fight. As the store grew quieter in the late afternoon, Grace sat in the small break room, cradling a mug of tea. Her co-worker Jess poked her head in. "You okay? You've been kind of quiet today." Grace forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." Jess raised an eyebrow. "About the woman and kid who came in yesterday?" Grace blinked. "How'd you know?" "They asked about your dad, right? Figured that might stir up some stuff." Jess sat down across from her, her tone casual but curious. "Do you know what you're gonna do?" Grace sighed. "I don't know. I haven't seen him since I was a kid, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to." Jess leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Fair enough, but maybe he's trying to make things right. People can change, you know." Grace frowned, her grip tightening on the mug. "Yeah, well, they can also let you down over and over again." Jess didn't push further, sensing that Grace needed space. "Well, whatever you decide, I've got your back." 2 days later, Naomi and Sienna returned to Skylight Books. Sienna carried her notebook, clutching it tightly as they walked through the door. Grace, who had been arranging a display near the entrance, stiffened when she saw them. "Hi," Naomi said softly, her tone cautious but kind. "We didn't mean to bother you again, but I thought you might want to talk." Grace's expression hardened. "I told you I don't want anything to do with him." Naomi nodded, her demeanor calm. "I understand, and I won't force you to do anything. But as a mother, I can tell you this. The love a parent has for their child doesn't go away, no matter how much time has passed." Grace's jaw tightened, but she didn't walk away. Naomi continued, her voice steady. "Sienna's father left us when she was little. It hasn't been easy, but I've seen how much it's meant to her to have people in her life who care. And I think your father cares more than you realize." Grace's eyes flickered with something. Hesitation, perhaps. "You don't know him," she said quietly. "No, I don't," Naomi admitted, "but I've seen what he's willing to do to try and make things right." For a moment, Grace said nothing. Then she looked at Sienna, who was watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. "Why do you care so much?" Grace asked the little girl. "Because he misses you," Sienna said simply, "and everyone deserves a second chance." Grace stared at her, the weight of the words sinking in. Finally, she let out a sigh. "I need time to think." Naomi nodded, not pushing further. "That's all we ask." The crisp air of Civic Center Park carried the faint sounds of the city, a car horn in the distance, the chatter of pedestrians, the rhythmic clang of a streetcar bell. Dan Whitaker stood by the fountain, his hands trembling as he clutched the photograph of Grace. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and an older man walking his dog. Dan's breath hung visibly in the air, but the chill in his chest came from something much deeper than the cold. He checked his watch for the third time, his pulse quickening. She said she'd come. Would she really? Grace Whitaker walked slowly toward the park, her steps hesitant. The past few days had been a storm of emotions, memories she had buried clawing their way back to the surface. Her father had been a ghost in her life for over a decade, and now he was asking to step back into it. She wasn't sure what she wanted. Closure, answers, maybe just a chance to say all the things she'd kept bottled up. Her pace slowed as she spotted him by the fountain. He looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched against the wind. But there was no mistaking the photograph in his hands. She clenched her fists, her emotions warring between anger and longing. Dan saw her before she spoke. For a moment he froze, unsure whether to approach or wait. Grace's expression was guarded, her steps deliberate as she closed the distance between them. When she finally stopped a few feet away, the silence between them was almost unbearable. "You wanted to see me," Grace said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Dan swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "Grace," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for coming." Grace crossed her arms, her posture stiff. "Why now?" she demanded. "Why, after all these years, do you suddenly want to talk?" Dan hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "Because I've spent every day since you left wishing I could go back and do things differently," he said finally. "But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to make things right now." Grace's eyes narrowed. Make things right? You think showing up and saying sorry is going to fix anything? Do you even know what it was like for me after you gave up? Dan's shoulders slumped, his head bowing under the force of her words. I didn't give up on you, he said softly. I gave up on myself, and I'm so sorry for that. Grace's voice rose, her anger spilling out. You didn't even fight for me. You just let them take me. Do you know how that felt? Like I wasn't worth it. Dan felt tears sting his eyes. You were worth it, he said, his voice cracking. You were always worth it, but I was too broken to see how to fight. Losing your mom, it destroyed me, Grace, and instead of being there for you, I let my pain take over. I let you down, and I've regretted it every day since. From a bench nearby, Sienna and Naomi watched the exchange, their presence unnoticed by Dan and Grace. Sienna's heart ached as she listened to the raw emotion in their voices. She turned to her mother, her eyes pleading. Mom, I have to help. Naomi hesitated but nodded. Be careful, sweetheart. Sienna slid off the bench and approached quietly. She stopped just a few feet away, waiting for a lull in the conversation before speaking. Miss Grace? Sienna's small voice broke through the tension. Grace turned, startled by the interruption. Her gaze softened slightly as she recognized the little girl who had been so insistent about helping her father. Sienna, right? Grace said, her tone gentler than before. Sienna nodded, her expression earnest. I know you're mad at him, she said, glancing at Dan before looking back at Grace. But he's trying really hard to be better, and I think he misses you more than anything in the world. Grace blinked, caught off guard by the child's sincerity. It's not that simple, she said, her voice quieter now. I know, Sienna replied, but sometimes when things are really hard, you have to forgive people anyway, even if it takes time. Dan wiped out his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. She's right, Grace. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or maybe ever. I just wanted you to know how much I love you and how sorry I am. Grace looked at Dan, then at Sienna, her emotions swirling. She could see the pain etched into her father's face, the same pain that mirrored her own. For the first time, her anger began to waver, replaced by something softer, tentative hope. I don't know if I can forgive you, Grace admitted, her voice trembling. But I'll think about it. Dan nodded, relief washing over him. That's all I can ask. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Grace turned to leave. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. Maybe we can talk again. Sometime. Dan's breath caught, and he nodded. I'd like that. Sienna smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She reached up and tugged gently on Dan's sleeve. See? I told you. Dan chuckled softly, his eyes glistening. Yeah, kid, you did. Later that evening, as Grace walked home, she pulled out her phone and stared at Naomi's number, saved earlier in case she wanted to reach out. After a moment's hesitation, she texted a single line. Thank you. I'm not ready yet, but I'm thinking about it. Back at the shelter, Dan sat on his cot, holding the photograph of Grace. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of rebuilding what had been lost. The quiet hum of the Denver Outreach Services shelter filled the air as Grace Whitaker stepped through its doors for the first time. Her heart raced as she took in her surroundings, the faded posters on the walls, the mix of warmth and weariness in the faces of the people around her. She clutched her phone tightly in her hand, Naomi's number still visible on the screen. It had taken hours of pacing and debating before she had finally decided to come. A volunteer greeted her with a warm smile. Hi there, can I help you? I'm here to see Dan Whitaker, Grace said, her voice quieter than she intended. The volunteer's face lit up. Dan, he's in the common room. Right this way. Grace followed, her steps hesitant but deliberate. As they turned the corner, she spotted him sitting near the window, a familiar photograph in his hands. He looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious hope. Grace, Dan said softly, rising to his feet. Hi, Dad, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. They sat together in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Dan broke the silence. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you would. Grace shifted in her seat, her eyes darting to the photograph on the table. I wasn't sure either, she admitted, but I wanted to see for myself. I wanted to know, why now? Why try to reconnect after all this time? Dan took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting nervously. Because I've spent years running from my mistakes, pretending that if I stayed away, I couldn't hurt you anymore. But I was wrong. Staying away, it didn't fix anything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm trying to be better. Grace looked at him, her expression unreadable. Trying? Dan nodded, reaching into a small bag beside him. He pulled out a battered notebook, its cover creased and worn. This, he said, placing it on the table, is my journal. I started writing in it when I came here. It's not much, but it's helped me work through everything. My mistakes, my regrets, and the things I hope for. Grace hesitated before picking up the notebook. She flipped through its pages, her eyes scanning the messy handwriting. Some entries were short, raw admissions of guilt. Others were longer, detailing memories of better times. One page caught her attention. At the top, in bold letters, Dan had written, Grace. Below it, he had listed everything he remembered about her. Her favorite bedtime stories, her love of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and the way she used to hum when she was nervous. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she read. You remembered all of this? Dan nodded, his voice breaking. Every word. Grace closed the notebook gently and placed it back on the table. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you, she said honestly, but I think I'd like to get to know you again. Dan's shoulders sagged with relief, a small, grateful smile forming on his face. That's more than I could have hoped for. Across town, Maria Castillo sat at her desk at the Denver Gazette, scrolling through the growing response to her series on homelessness. After her article on Sienna's prayer had gone viral, she had delved deeper into the systemic challenges faced by Denver's homeless population. Housing insecurity, lack of mental health resources, and the stigma that kept so many from seeking help. Her latest piece, Bridging the Divide, How Communities Can Help the Homeless Rebuild Their Lives, had sparked a wave of support. Local organizations reported increases in donations and volunteers, and several city officials had reached out to discuss potential policy changes. Maria smiled as she opened an email from Pastor Caleb. He had attached photos from the shelter's recent winter charity event, organized in part by Naomi Caldwell. The event had brought together people from all walks of life, former shelter residents, volunteers, and donors, proving that small acts of kindness could ripple outward in powerful ways. At the shelter, Naomi stood by a table stacked with donated blankets and coats, her hands busy organizing supplies for distribution. She glanced across the room and spotted Sienna helping a younger boy try on a new pair of gloves. Sienna's face lit up as the boy grinned, and Naomi felt a surge of pride. Naomi, Pastor Caleb said, approaching with a clipboard, I wanted to thank you again for all your help. The turnout for the charity event was incredible. Naomi smiled. It's been a blessing to be part of something like this. Seeing how much it means to the community, it's humbling. Caleb nodded, his gaze drifting toward Dan and Grace, who were still deep in conversation by the window. And it looks like your daughter's kindness is still working its magic. Naomi followed his gaze, her heart swelling as she watched Grace laugh softly at something Dan had said. It was a sound she hadn't expected to hear today, a sound that spoke of hope and healing. As the evening wore on, Grace prepared to leave the shelter. She turned to Dan, her voice hesitant but sincere. I'd like to come back, maybe next week? Dan's face lit up, his smile wide and genuine. I'd like that, he said. Grace nodded, her heart feeling lighter as she walked toward the exit. Before she left, she paused to look back. Thank you for remembering. Dan watched her go, the photograph of her still in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Peace. That night, as the lights in the shelter dimmed, Dan sat on his cot with his journal open on his lap. He flipped to the page titled Grace and added a new line. She came back. The streets of Denver were quieter as the winter season settled deeper into its hold. Inside her small apartment, Grace Whitaker sat at her kitchen table, a steaming mug of tea beside her, her hands clasped tightly around the warm ceramic. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls, echoing the heaviness she felt inside. Her eyes wandered to the photo album she had pulled from a storage box earlier that evening. It had been years since she'd opened it. The edges were frayed, the leather cover faded, but the memories inside were vivid, both beautiful and bittersweet. Grace flipped through the pages slowly. The first few were filled with photos of her as a baby, her mother, Sarah, holding her close with a wide, joyful smile. Then came the pictures of her father. In one, Dan had Grace perched on his shoulders at a park, her tiny hands clutching his hair as she laughed. Another showed him crouching beside her as she proudly displayed a messy painting she had made in kindergarten. She paused on a photo of the three of them together, taken during a family camping trip. They looked so happy, so whole. But as she stared at the image, the memories of what came after began to seep in. Nights waiting by the window for her dad to come home, mornings when he didn't wake up in time to take her to school, and the day he told her she would be living with her aunt. Grace closed the album and leaned back in her chair, her chest tight. The resentment she had carried for years swirled inside her. But so did something else, an ache she couldn't ignore. She didn't just miss her father, she missed the family they had been. Her thoughts drifted to Naomi Caldwell. The conversation they'd had at the bookstore replayed in her mind. Naomi's words had struck a chord she hadn't been ready to acknowledge then. The love a parent has for their child doesn't go away, no matter how much time has passed. Grace sighed and reached for her phone. Before she could second-guess herself, she dialed Naomi's number. "Grace?" Naomi's voice was warm but surprised. "Hi," Grace said softly. Do you have a minute?" "Of course," Naomi replied. "What's on your mind?" Grace hesitated, then said, "How did you do it? How did you keep going after Sienna's dad left? Didn't you ever just want to give up?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Naomi spoke, her voice gentle. "There were days when it felt impossible," she admitted. "Days when I was angry or scared or just tired of doing it all alone. But I looked at Sienna and I saw how much she needed me. That kept me going." Grace bit her lip, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't forgive him?" "You don't have to forgive him right away," Naomi said. "But holding on to anger forever won't bring you peace. Sometimes forgiveness is as much for you as it is for them." Grace closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't even know where to start." "Start small," Naomi said. "Take it one step at a time. The fact that you're even thinking about it is a step in itself." The next day, Grace walked into a craft store near her apartment. She wandered the aisles, unsure of exactly what she was looking for, until her eyes landed on a small silver frame. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. Then she added it to her basket, along with a set of colorful pens. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the photo album open in front of her, and the pens arranged neatly by her side. She spent hours carefully selecting pictures and writing small notes on the backs, memories she wanted to share with her father. When she was done, she placed everything in a simple gift bag, her heart pounding at the thought of what she was about to do. 2 days later, Grace stood outside the Denver Outreach Services shelter, clutching the bag tightly in her hands. She had texted Dan earlier that morning to let him know she was coming, and now she felt the nerves bubbling inside her. The door opened, and Dan stepped out, his eyes widening slightly when he saw her. "Grace," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and relief. "Hi," she replied, her lips curving into a tentative smile. "Can we talk?" "Of course," Dan said, stepping aside to let her in. They sat together in the common area, the bag resting on Grace's lap. Dan waited patiently, sensing she had something important to say. "I've been thinking a lot," Grace began, her voice steady but soft, "about everything that happened, and about you." Dan nodded, his hands resting on his knees. "Take your time." Grace reached into the bag and pulled out the photo album. "I found this," she said, placing it on the table between them. "I thought maybe we could look through it together." Dan's breath hitched as he stared at the album. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the cover. The first photo was one he hadn't seen in years. Grace as a baby, sleeping in Sarah's arms. "I remember this day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were so nervous bringing you home from the hospital." Grace smiled faintly. "I always wondered if you were scared." Terrified, Dan admitted with a soft laugh. But your mom, she had this way of making everything feel okay. They flipped through the album together, sharing memories and filling in the gaps of each other's lives. Grace told Dan about her favorite teachers, the books that had shaped her, and the small victories she'd celebrated. Dan listened intently, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. When they reached the last page, Grace pulled out the silver frame from her bag. Inside was a photo of the two of them from the camping trip, one of her favorites. She slid it across the table. I thought you might want this. Dan stared at the photo, his eyes glistening. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace reached across the table and placed her hand on his. I'm not saying everything's okay, she said, her voice steady, but I think I want to try. Dan nodded, his heart full of emotion. That's all I could ever ask for. That night, as Grace walked home, she felt a weight lifting from her chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, not just for her father, but for the possibility of healing. The snow had begun to melt in Denver, giving way to crisp but sunny mornings that hinted at the coming spring. For Dan Whitaker, each day felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild a life he had long thought irreparable. His mornings now began not on a park bench or in a crowded shelter, but in his own modest apartment. The space was small, just a one-bedroom in an older building on the edge of downtown, but it was his. The walls were bare except for a single photograph framed and hung above the couch. A picture of Grace from years ago, smiling with her father on a family camping trip. It was a gift Grace had given him during one of their recent meetings, a symbol of the bridge they were slowly building between their past and their future. Dan stood at the stove, frying eggs and humming softly, a habit he'd picked up during his early days at the shelter's community kitchen. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he picked it up, smiling when he saw the caller ID. Craig, he answered, his voice warm. Craig Hollis chuckled on the other end. Hey, Dan, just checking in. How's the new job treating you? Dan glanced at the clock, knowing he had to leave soon to make it to the construction site. It's good, he replied. Better than good, actually. It feels right, like I'm part of something again. Craig's voice was full of encouragement. That's what I like to hear. You've got the skills, Dan. You just needed the opportunity. Thanks for giving me that chance, Dan said sincerely. I won't let you down. You haven't yet, Craig replied. And hey, don't forget about the team dinner next week. We want to hear more about that daughter of yours. Dan chuckled. I'll be there. Across town, Grace Whitaker stood in front of a group of volunteers gathered in the main hall of Denver Outreach Services. She held a clipboard in one hand and gestured with the other as she spoke, her voice confident and clear. Homelessness isn't just about not having a roof over your head, she said. It's about losing your sense of self, your connection to others, and your hope for the future. But every small action we take, whether it's donating a coat, serving a meal, or just offering a kind word, can help someone find their way back. The group nodded, a mixture of seasoned volunteers and newcomers inspired by recent articles highlighting the shelter's work. Maria Castillo's series, which now included interviews with Grace and Dan, had sparked a wave of support across the city. After the meeting, Maria approached Grace, her camera slung over her shoulder. You're a natural, Maria said with a grin. Grace laughed, a little embarrassed. I just say what I've learned, most of it from my dad. Maria's eyes softened. He's come a long way. You both have. Thanks to people like you and Sienna, Grace replied. That little girl changed everything. Maria pulled out her notebook. Speaking of Sienna, I'd love to do a follow-up story on her. She's the one who started this whole thing. At the Caldwell apartment, Sienna sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. She was practicing spelling words, but her mind kept drifting to the interview she had with Maria earlier that afternoon. Mom, Sienna said, tapping her pencil on the table, do you think Mr. Dan and Miss Grace are happy now? Naomi looked up from the vegetables she was chopping for dinner, her face softening. I think they're getting there, she said. And a lot of that is because of you. Sienna grinned. Maria said she's going to write a new story about me. Isn't that cool? It's very cool, Naomi replied, placing a bowl of carrots on the table. But remember, you didn't do this for attention. You did it because it was the right thing to do. I know, Sienna said, her voice earnest, but if the story helps more people like Mr. Dan, then I'm glad. A week later, Dan, Grace, Sienna, Naomi, and Pastor Caleb gathered around a small but welcoming dining table in Grace's apartment. The room was filled with the smell of baked chicken and rosemary potatoes, the clinking of glasses, and the warmth of shared laughter. Dan sat next to Grace, his heart full as he watched her talk animatedly with Naomi about the shelter's next fundraiser. Across the table, Sienna was trying to convince Pastor Caleb to let her visit the shelter again soon. As the plates were cleared and dessert was served, the conversation turned to memories, both the painful and the joyful. Grace shared stories from her childhood that Dan had missed, and Dan opened up about his journey at the shelter and the people who had helped him along the way. Finally, as the evening wound down, Dan raised his glass of sparkling cider. The room quieted as he cleared his throat. I just want to say thank you to all of you. He looked at Sienna, his voice filled with emotion. Especially you, kid. If it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be sitting here today. Sienna beamed. I just prayed. You did the rest. Dan chuckled, his eyes glistening. Maybe, but that prayer, it started everything. He turned to Grace, his voice trembling. And to you, Grace, thank you for giving me a second chance. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. Grace placed a hand on his, her smile soft and genuine. You don't have to do it all at once, Dad. We'll take it one day at a time. As the evening came to a close, Dan lingered by the door, looking out at the city lights beyond the window. Grace joined him, leaning against the doorframe. Everything feels different now, she said quietly. It is, Dan replied. For the first time in a long time, I feel like there's a future. Grace smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Me too. And in the quiet of that moment, Dan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A little girl's prayer on a cold winter night had sparked a chain of events he never could have imagined. It had given him hope, redemption, and most importantly, a chance to rebuild the most important relationship of his life. All it took, Dan said softly, was one act of kindness. The story of Dan, Grace, Sienna, and Naomi is a powerful reminder of how small acts of kindness can create ripples of change, transforming lives in ways we can't always predict. From Sienna's simple prayer to the larger community rallying around Dan, this journey shows us that compassion, forgiveness, and second chances are at the heart of healing and growth. But what about you? Have you ever experienced or given a second chance that changed everything? Do you think forgiveness is always possible, or are there times when it's just too hard to move forward? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your own experiences or reflections in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the impact of kindness and the strength it takes to forgive. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We have many more heartwarming and inspiring stories coming your way, and we'd love for you to be part of this journey. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon.